It's about what you know. It's about where you go. If you really want to know, it's the Leo Larry Show. It's about what you know. It's about where you go. If you really want to know, it's the Leo Larry Show.
Good evening once again, my friends, our friends, and welcome once again to the Leo and Larry Show. My name is Leo Whitberry, and my co-host is
Larry Smith.
Okay, and this evening we have a special guest. All of our guests are special, but they're special in their own way. And so, Larry, why don't you do the introduction this evening?
Reverend Woodbury, we are blessed to have the opportunity to talk to the daughter of a legend. We have as our guest today, Mary Lynn Diggs, the daughter of Cordelia and William P. Diggs.
Mm-hmm.
And she is the South Carolina director of the Head Start collaboration.
Mm. Yes,
she
wonderful.
has a wealth of knowledge, not only from Florence, but she was born in Rock Hill. Am I correct?
No, I was born in Mobile, Alabama.
Mobile, Alabama.
That's my mother's hometown. But
Uh-huh.
Rock Hill, and they brought me to Rock Hill when I was 6 weeks old. And there's a little background to that. At the time, colored babies couldn't be born in the hospital in York County. They had a little house in the back behind the hospital. And my grandmother in Alabama told my mother she had to come home. And my daddy took her to Alabama in November. And I was born in St. Martin de Porres Hospital, downtown Mobile, Alabama. And when I was 6 weeks old, they brought me back to Rock Hill.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So why don't you tell us a little about yourself, what you do, what you aspire to do? We want to talk about your father also. I mean, we missed him, but he left his mark. He left his legacy.
Yes, he did. I am the older child of Dr. and Mrs. William Diggs. I have a brother, William Diggs Jr. Most people call him Bill. He lives in Florence. I'm director of the South Carolina Head Start Collaboration Office, and there's a collaboration director in every state. As you know, Head Start is a federal program. It is pure federal money. There are no state dollars in Head Start. It's federal to local. It serves children 0 to 5 whose household incomes are 100% of poverty or less. So that's $30,000 or less for a family of 4. And the Head Start Collaboration Office is the point of entry in state government for and on behalf of Head Start children and their families to ensure that not only do they receive all of the services that a local Head Start program provides, but that they're included in whatever else goes on in your state that would help strengthen and lift families and lift them out of poverty. So my office is at the Department of Social Services. It was assigned here by a former governor. So the award for this grant is pure federal. It's awarded to a governor, and the governor assigns it to a state agency. So we're at the Department of Social Services in the Division of Early Care and Education.
Wow, yeah, very, very important. Early care, education, and Head Start really assist a lot of students so that they make a strong start. I know I often look at kids count, at that data, which is submitted from across the country, from the school districts. And I tell people this data is accurate, because it comes from the schools. And having a good Head Start is so important because so many students, particularly Black students and males, by the time they get to the 3rd grade, they're already functioning at a level where they're not proficient in basic the foundations and competencies of education, reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Yes. And keep in mind, there are 2 states where the majority of the Head Start programs are located in community action agencies. And there is a New England state, and then South Carolina. At one time, a Head Start program had to be in a community action agency. And then some former presidents kind of changed it where others could compete. But in South Carolina, over 85% of all Head Start programs are still in community action agencies.
Is that for the foreseeable future, or do you think the Republican majority may change that?
Well, what we're finding is it really isn't a party issue. Sometimes it's where states want to have more of a quote unquote say so. We won't say control, but more of a say so, because in South Carolina gets about $140 million for Head Start services. So most state governments would be interested in that, so they could get at least 5 or 10% off the top. But they can't do that in South Carolina. The money goes directly to the service areas, and we have 24 Head Start programs in South Carolina.
I read recently that there is a program at foot to get Head Start programs on college campuses so that young people who are in college can have daycare service, can have free daycare service.
That's right. It was in the Washington Post. But one thing that I think is interesting, and I think that happens as we age, what we don't realize that in the early years, there were Head Start programs on college campuses. In fact, Voorhees College in South Carolina was a Head Start grantee. It's not that a Head Start program put it on there. The program belonged to Voorhees College. They were one of the first Head Start grantees, meaning assigned by the federal government to have Head Start in the country. And the first training and technical assistance entity in the Southeast for Head Start was at South Carolina State, and it's Family Consumer Science. And Morris College has a Head Start Center. And for a long time, Benedict College had a Head Start Center on the campus. So this is something, and then Fort Valley is a Head Start program. So this is something that others are beginning to look at because they see that it has worked. It has been moved from some places, but in early years, there were Head Start centers on college campuses, particularly HBCUs, but those schools in some instances were actually the home where the grant was awarded to that school. So now they're coming back around. So you have a group coming now that may not have lived during that time. Head Start started in 1965.
Yes, it's been around a while. And what are some of the things that Head Start does to help lift families out of poverty?
Head Start is the only comprehensive early care programs. There are others that are moving toward that. But when we talk about being comprehensive, a Head Start child has to have a medical home. So they have to have a board certified dentist. They have to have a doctor. We want to be respectful of school nurses and public school programs, but Head Start children have to have a medical home. So they have to have a doctor, they have to have a nurse, and then they have to have other special services if they're needed. And even with the bus, Head Start children have to have a harness and a seatbelt on their bus. And they have to have bus monitors on the bus, not just the bus driver on the bus. And in the classroom, you have to have at least 2 teachers. And of course, we have a certain number that you can have in the classroom if you're 4, but if you're 3 and 4, if you have 3 and 4-year-olds, you can have more in the classroom, but our numbers are not as large. And Head Start children cannot have candy and cookies at school. They can have fruit. They can have fruit. They eat fresh vegetables and they have fruit. And of course, they have playtime, but their playtime is a form of interaction. It's not just playing in the dirt. So, and then they have persons who visit their families where the families choose. Sometimes they don't want them to come to their house. They may meet them at the library, meet them at the McDonald's, but family. And one thing that is a real focus for South Carolina Head Start that we appreciate is that Head Start in South Carolina has a strong fatherhood initiative. And we recognize that quite often in whatever family, whether it's Head Start or other families, the households may not be a 2-parent household, but that doesn't mean that you don't have 2 parents. So our fathers are very active, and the Fatherhood Conference will be at Myrtle Beach the end of April. And persons come from 7 states to the South Carolina Head Start Fatherhood Conference. So fathers can be involved with and help raise their children, whether they live with them or not. So we're excited about South Carolina and South Carolina's Head Start programs.
And that is even more important today than it was back in 1965. I was actually looking at some statistics this week, and 71% of Black children are born to single mothers.
Yes.
Back in the 1990s, the percentage of people who were married was 63%. 2019, it was down to 57%. And, the way society is going now, I'm pretty sure 2021, 2022 figures are going to show even more of a decline of two parents in the home with a child.
Well, I really appreciate the Head Start family accepting me, because I did other things prior to this. My first job was with UNCF. And I mentioned to Larry the other day, because a lot of people say, well, oh, you could have done this, that, and the other. And yes, I worked on Governor Riley's staff when he was governor of South Carolina. And for those of us from the PD may not know, but former Governor Riley's wife was from Florence. Her name was Tunky Yarborough. And the governor assigned somebody from every congressional district. And I was from the 6th congressional district and happened to have been from Mrs. Riley's hometown. But, and I had some opportunities to do some other things. I ran Jim Clyburn's campaign when he ran for Secretary of State. And there are others who feel, oh, why do you do with Head Start? But I felt I didn't have a reason not to work with and on behalf of and for Head Start. And I shared with Larry an experience that he asked me to share with you about people I met who were at our house growing up. But the activist from Mississippi, Fannie Lou Hamer, visited us. She spoke for Women's Day at my home church. She spoke at Trinity for Women's Day when I was 14 years old. And the guest bedroom at our house is past my bedroom. So she used the bathroom that was near my bedroom. And when she was coming out of the bathroom, she asked me to come in the room and help her zip up her dress. And I saw the scars on her back where she was beaten in jail. And it changed me. It changed me. And as I tell people, I knew that she went to the wall for one of the first Head Start programs in the country in Sunflower County, Mississippi. And she could take a whipping on her back to ensure that people could vote or that families could have a comprehensive service. I didn't have the right not to accept this opportunity. And yes, I could have been in DC and I was offered a job to go and work in Congress, and it would have been wonderful, but I knew and understood. And then too, my father, along with Reverend Burgess, who was an AME minister at Mount Zion in Florence, and Dr. Alva Jones, worked to get Head Start in Florence. And I knew that it was not something that was well received in the early years, because it was a part of the war on poverty. And everybody didn't necessarily want it to happen. And I felt I didn't have the right not to take the assignment. And so I appreciate the Head Start family embracing me and welcoming me.
Well, we appreciate people like you. When I was in Mississippi, I was talking with one of my friends, and they had a play about the Freedom Riders, and one of the Freedom Riders was in the audience, and they didn't know, and they were talking about an incident where he was at Parchment Farm, with the notorious Parchment Farm, and he wouldn't say yes, sir, to the white guards, and they handcuffed him to a post, and they whipped him. They beat him, and then they let him off, and and they said, "We bet that taught you a lesson, boy. You'll say yes, sir, now, won't you?" I said, "You'll say yes, sir, now, won't you?" And they said all he did was walk back to the post and put his hands up.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you don't find that kind of commitment and courage very much today, right?
That's true. That is true. And then when we were talking about that and with the Freedom Riders, because Larry and I had talked about persons who had visited us in Florence, persons who came to our church, who visited our home, and Clary Collins Harvey in Mississippi spoke at Trinity for Women's Day. And people knew her family is having a big insurance company in Mississippi and having a Collins funeral home. But she was one of those who helped to sustain the Freedom Riders, to get the money for everything to be in place for the Freedom Riders. And I remember her talking to us when I was a student. She was the first Spelman graduate to get an honorary degree from the school, because at one time they didn't have honorary degrees, but she got the first one. She was a graduate of Spelman, but she got an honorary degree in 1977. And she talked about her experience with the freedom movement. And it encouraged those of us who were in that class, who were graduating, to know that she went to the wall and that she made sure that the Freedom Riders had food. But she visited us in Florence, and she spoke for Women's Day at Trinity back in the 80s.
Let it be noted that Mary Lynn was also the national president of the Spelman Alumni Association at one point.
Yeah, I was president of the Spelman Alumni Association from 92 to 96. And last year I rotated off of Spelman's Board of Trustees, having been on there for 9 years. And I really appreciate it. Larry knows we laugh about it. I'm what you call a Spell House baby. My daddy was in the Morehouse class of 49, and my mother's in the class of 51. And my mother is 92 years old.
Oh, praise the Lord. Wow.
Yeah.
You know, the promise is 70 years. So boy,
Yes.
she's gotten more than the promise. She's got a whole host
So
of
she's
blessings.
she's what you call a diamond daughter. You know, if you've been out 50 years, you get that golden pen and you're a golden girl, but she's a diamond daughter because she's been out over 70 years.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Well,
it's been a
about
good
the
life.
Rock Hill years, Mary Lynn, talk about the early Rock Hill years.
But the early Rock Hill years, you know, as you know, Rock Hill was home for my father. My father was born in Columbia, because my grandmother was on faculty at Benedict, and my grandfather took a church in Union, South Carolina, and my father went to preschool in Union, and the people who didn't look like them poisoned my grandfather's well at the house because they said my grandfather spoke up too much for the colored people. So he moved his family to Rock Hill, and my father and his 4 siblings lived with their grandmother. Now my great grandmother was the wife of Mansell Philip Hall, who founded Friendship Junior College. So that was my father's great grandfather, who founded Friendship in 1891. And my grandfather moved my father and his siblings to Rock Hill when in the early 30s. And as you heard me say, I was moved there when I was 6 weeks old in 1955. But the first sit-ins in South Carolina were Friendship College students. Sometimes people read about the Friendship 9. They sat in 1961, but in 1960, 1 week after the students sat in Greensboro, students in Rock Hill at Friendship Junior College sat in. My father was the college minister, and over 100 students were arrested, and they were arrested more than one time. So I had to go. I was a little girl, but my parents at that time had the one child, and I went everywhere with my father. My mother explained that she was concerned later on because I would go to the jailhouse with them to get the students, or to take food to them, or to take material for them to do their homework while they were in school. So I got a chance to be there when they got the students out of jail. And then, of course, as a little girl, I remember when John Lewis was whipped at the bus station in Rock Hill. And it wasn't until a few years ago when John Lewis came to Columbia, when Jim Clyburn hosted a particular civil rights march where persons from from Congress and writers came to see where students protested around the state, and then they marched from Zion Baptist Church in Columbia to the State House in Columbia. But I was sitting at Zion Baptist Church with my father and the AME Bishop James, and he and my father were very close, and I knew that, and he would come to visit us even when I was a little girl. When John Lewis saw the two of them, he started crying, and my father never really told us what that was about. I knew John Lewis knew him, but I didn't know how. And John Lewis told the group that, of course, when students were whipped at the bus station in Rock Hill, that Bishop James, who was then pastoring in Sumter, got the funeral home in Sumter to get funeral cars and put students in the cars and take them through the woods. It was Palmer Funeral Home in Sumter. And they put students in the cars and brought them through the woods coming from Rock Hill into Sumter. Mrs. Palmer fixed them sandwiches, and then they took the students back to Atlanta. That's how Dad and Bishop James became friends and always kept in touch. So some people wondered, well, how is it that Dr. Diggs will have an AME bishop to preach with him? They didn't know what the two of them had to go through, because not only did they help move students, but they spent their own money bailing the students out of jail. And a lot don't know. I mentioned to Larry that at an earlier time, my father was arrested and accused of stealing a typewriter and trying to sell it. And I saw the newspapers, and so he had a copy of it, and it was falling apart. And I contacted the newspaper in Rock Hill, and they said they don't have it on record anymore. But as it turned out, he and my mother were in the grocery store one day in the Wilson Open Air Market in Rock Hill, and a policeman spoke to him, and my father tipped his hat, and my mother turned her head and went the other way. And it came out in the court later on that the police intentionally had my father arrested and charged him with something that was not true, because they felt they should put my mother in check because she was too snooty. And so during that time when they were having the trial, they sent me and my mother to Alabama on the train, and we stayed with my grandparents in Alabama until the case was over. And later, Daddy, everything was lifted from him, but they had indicted him, and they lifted the indictment later.
Right.
So it's been an interesting process. And then he became a faculty member at Benedict. And I later found out that he was involved in helping the Benedict students in their march downtown when they unveiled those bricks downtown. He was invited to the luncheon. And what we found out was he would meet with the students every day, and then he would drive to Florence because he was no longer pastoring in York County. We were living in Florence, and he would drive to Florence, and then the students would march because they wanted to. The NAACP, Ida Quincy Newman and others protected him because of what had happened in Rock Hill.
Yes, I mean, and he did so much. He did so much while he was pastoring Trinity Baptist Church, and I know he was a force. When I moved there, I heard his name right away, and along with Bishop James and others, and a whole lot. And Larry, you and I have talked about this before. A whole lot of things didn't go on in Florence without people consulting with Reverend Diggs. And if something went wrong in Florence, and it was along racial lines, you could be sure that Reverend Diggs was going to weigh in on it. That was the case with your father.
Yeah, well, he was very focused on it. There were some who asked why would he pastor in Florence, and I saw something on PBS a few years ago, and it's at the museum in York County, where he was interviewed in the late 50s when he was pastoring in York, South Carolina. And they said, well, we've talked to lawyers and doctors here, and you're a minister, and you've been to school longer than they have. Why do you live in York? And he said that, he finished Morehouse College, but he went to Colgate, Rochester to divinity school. And he was the only Black in his class. And Dr. Latta Thomas was in the next group. And then they had Harry Wright, Marion Wright Edelman's brother, Bennettsville, finished Colgate, and they were all there together. The children didn't find out that they were there to really help desegregate, because Colgate had been a mixed school, then it segregated, then it had to desegregate. So those men were the ones in the early 50s who desegregated the seminary in the early 50s up in Rochester. But he responded when I saw this PBS film of him in the late 50s, he said he didn't have the right not to come back to South Carolina. And yes, he could have pastored, and they asked him, said, well, you could have been in New York and you could have been in Chicago. But he said that South Carolina was home for him, and the people in South Carolina had encouraged him, and that he didn't have a right not to. And I feel the same way as relates to my everyday work. So he came back home.
Tell us about your family's relationship with Dr. Benjamin Mays.
Benjamin Mays, as you know, was the president of Morehouse College. And my father, as you know, finished Morehouse in the class of 49, but in his first year of college, he really went to North Carolina A&T as a pre-dental student. And he was, then the military got him, and they brought him down when they realized that he was a science student. They let him go back and do work. And then they let him come back. And Daddy was a licensed dental tech. A lot of people didn't know that, but he was a licensed, he got to be a licensed dental tech at the med school in Denver, Colorado. But he went to World War II, and he said on the way back from Japan, he realized that, you know, he didn't need to be going to dentistry. He got that call when riding on that ship, 30 days coming back from Japan, coming back to the United States. So he got real involved from that perspective. And as relates to the pastorate, he felt he should be a pastor and be involved and to lift people from for perspective. Now, there was something in particular you wanted me to tell you other than that, Larry. What was that?
About your relationship with Dr. Benjamin Mays.
Well, Benjamin Mays was the president of Morehouse College. And Dr. J.D. Rucker and Rock Hill had gone to Howard, the seminary, when Benjamin Mays was the dean there. And he drove my father to, Reverend Rucker drove my father to Atlanta, and Benjamin Mays admitted him to Morehouse. But Benjamin Mays was very focused on his students. You know, a lot of people thought, oh, well, you know, he's big time and he'll be going to New York and he'll be going to Detroit. He came to Florence. He came to Florence to visit us. And in fact, he spoke at our church twice. And Larry knows my little brother, and I shouldn't say little brother, my brother Bill. And Bill tells the story that when he was 4 years old, Benjamin Mays was at our house, and he was going to be preaching in our church the next day. And but my mother had fixed him breakfast, so she fixed him country ham and eggs. And my brother was standing next to him at the breakfast table. And Dr. Mays said, young man, what can I do for you? And my brother said, you want your ham? And he said, well, you want my ham? And he said, yes. And Benny Mays gave him his ham off his plate. My brother said, that's why he went to Morehouse. He said he was 4. He said, if this man could give me the ham off his plate, I didn't have the right not to go to Morehouse. But Benjamin Mays met with his students when my father was a student, and you'll see it in Mays' books, but even in discussions that Daddy had with us and all of his schoolmates, Benjamin Mays met with Morehouse men every Tuesday morning. And he would tell them, you might ride on the back of the bus, but you sit on, your mind is on the front seat. And he was supportive of all of them. And I met a minister in Batesburg who had gone to Morehouse, and Benjamin Mays had gone to his church. So he supported his students wherever they were, whether they were students and then after they graduated and in later years. And as I said, he came to our house and he visited us, and he stayed at our house overnight. He didn't stay in the hotel. He stayed at our house, and he spoke at Trinity. And he spoke one year for Education Day, and a president of another school was supposed to have come and didn't, and said, oh, Diggs, you can get somebody else because you know a lot of people. So I'm not going to come to your church. I'm going to go to do such and such. And Benny Mays saw Daddy 2 weeks before that at a meeting in Atlanta. And he said, well, you know, how things going, Diggs? And Daddy said, and then Benjamin Mays had retired. And he told him, he said, well, you know, I don't have Education Day speaker. And Dr. Mays said, well, you know, I've been to visit you before, but if you'll have me, I'll come. So he came. And it was on the front page. And the president of the other college said, Diggs, you didn't have to do me like that. You didn't have to do that at Benjamin Mays. But Benjamin Mays was committed to being supportive of his students. So he came to be supportive, and his picture was on the front page of the Florence Morning News that he spoke for Education Day at Trinity.
And so,
what was it like growing up in Florence?
Beg your pardon?
What was it like growing up in Florence?
It was very interesting. The Florence people have always been very, very good to us. They've always been very supportive, very protective. As I've gotten older, I've grown to understand some things that they really did protect us. As Larry knows, I was one of the first children to desegregate schools in Florence in 1965. And I rode the bus with the Highway Patrol escort every day. But the people in the community would walk around our house. They would check. And I didn't, as I grew older, I understood it. They checked on the house, and yeah, policemen would check on it because a highway patrolman would follow me every day, make sure I got in the house. But people in the community would walk that yard and check us, particularly if daddy were involved in other meetings, and mama would have us at home at night, and our babysitter would be there with us. So growing up in Florence was a good thing. The people were really good. Now they tease us about it because my mother was a good cook, and she cooked for my daddy. Now the people in Florence were good. They were good to us, but he ate at home. So he said, "You married to a preacher, you feed your man on Sunday." But the people in Florence were very, very supportive of us in any and every way. I was I had to testify. I was for a situation in Atlanta. I was someone who saw something, and other people had seen it, but they had gotten some people had gotten arrested, some people had gotten whipped, some people had gotten shot. But I was a witness to something in Atlanta, and I was 17. And the case came up when I was getting ready to turn 19. And when I walked out of the back gate at Spelman to go to a class at Morehouse, there was a man sitting there in a black Cadillac, and I knew him, but I'm like, why is he sitting here? Now, he kind of, you all know what number runners are. So I knew he was kind of in that life, I knew him. And he was sitting there, and he said, Lil Diggs, we know that you are a witness in this case. And you're from Florence, and we take care of Florence people. So as long as this case is going on, I'm sitting at this back gate, and he had a list of places I was not to go in Atlanta.
Wow.
So for me to stay safe, he said, so I'm gonna sit here as long as this is going on, and when the case is over and everything's okay, then I'm gonna go back to Florence. So the people in Florence have always been very, very supportive of us. Even when my father was in the hospital, some people would come and visit, people I didn't know, and they would tell me, well, your father helped us do this, or they helped get my daddy out of jail, or they helped my sister to go to school. He didn't tell us other folks' business. But people have been very responsive and have been very supportive. So growing up in Florence was interesting. Yes, I was one of the first children to desegregate the schools. Dr. Beck's daughter went to Royal. I went to Mackenzie. Dr. Williams' children went to Poynter and McClanagan and Mackenzie. Mr. Lester's children went to Mackenzie. Linda Pygott was the only Black child at South Florence High School. And I can't think of Marvin's last name, was the only Black child to go to McClanagan that first year in 65. So we had to ride to school with police escorts, and of course in the schools desegregated in 1970. And it was more interesting then because we hadn't been to school with the Black kids, and so they were not comfortable without having gone to school with the white kids. And then we were going back, across town with the Black kids, and then some white kids had to come. It was interesting. But that meant I got a chance to go to school with some of everybody. So it's been an interesting process. Florence has been a good place for us. The people have been very, very supportive of us. And but we had some experiences. Larry knows we had a lot of people who visited our church and visited our home. You heard me mention about Fannie Lou Hamer and Clary Collins Harvey in Mississippi, but Maxine Smith, who was over there in NAACP at the national level, but lived in Memphis, came to speak at our church at one time. And Dr. Burnett Johnson, who was the first Supreme Court Justice, Black Supreme Court Justice in Louisiana, spoke at Trinity. And then Senator Verdi Welcome, who was the first African-American woman to be elected to a state senate out
Mhm.
of Maryland, spoke for Women's Day at Trinity, and her daughter and I were friends in Atlanta. And C. Dolores Tucker, who many of you knew was the Secretary of State in Pennsylvania, spoke at Trinity for Women's Day. And then she later founded the National Congress on Black Women, along with Shirley Chisholm. And then the young lady who was Pat Timmons, and I can't remember her last name now, but the first Black on the state Supreme Court of North Carolina. And she grew up in Florence. In fact, she went to elementary school with me. Her father was in Vietnam, and she was riding that bus. They came when we were at McKinsey, and she's a retired Supreme Court justice. So we had some interesting experiences and some interesting people who visited us, who spent the night with us, and we got to learn from them. And I mentioned that because this is Women's History Month, but in light of it, there were other people who came, like Benjamin Mays, you heard me say, stayed with us twice. Daddy King came. Martin Luther King was supposed to have spoken at Trinity for Men's Day, which would have been in June. And he died in April. He and my father were at Morehouse together. And Daddy King came. And when Daddy King came, people asked, why are you here? And he said, this was my son was to come to preach for his friend. And I'm here for him. And you couldn't get near our house. All the sled agents were there. Everything was blocked off downtown. People were just all out in the street. Bernard Shaw from CNN spoke at Trinity for Education Day. And I don't know if you know that he was married, that he recently passed, but he's married to Linda Austin from Darlington. And so he took the train to come to Florence so he could talk to people on the train. And we appreciate his having come. And George Haley came, and of course, after Alex Haley's brother. George Haley who paid for him to write the book, but George was a UN ambassador, but he was Daddy's classmate, and he came. And of course, Leroy Johnson, who was the first Black in the state Senate in Georgia, came and spoke for Men's Day at our church. So we had some interesting guests to come. But the one thing that I appreciated about that time, about the 60s and the 70s and early 80s, those who were committed to lifting us as we climbed stuck together. It wasn't about their coming because you were going to pay them a lot of money. It wasn't because you lived in a big town or you were big time. They were all committed to our communities and our families. And I appreciate having had that experience and having to sit with us. They teased Don Fowler, who was over the National Democratic Party, teased me once because Daddy King was coming to South Carolina to speak. And it wasn't for our church, he was coming for the Democratic Party. But he told Fowler, okay, I'm coming, but you call Diggs' wife and you tell her to fix me something to eat. And my mother called me and told me, you got to leave work and come home because Daddy King is coming here. And when I got there, Don Fowler was there with the apron on because my mother had told him he had to help set the table because Daddy King told him, no, this is my son's friend and his wife gonna fix me something to eat. I'm not eating in those restaurants. So the people who were committed to that process stuck together, and I'm praying that we will understand that and move outward in the same direction.
That's what I was going to say. Knowing the history and seeing those changes and the struggles and the sacrifices that people made so that literally everyone's life has improved. I always say about America that the more inclusive America is, that it has really only made our country greater and stronger. But now we're at a place in history where there doesn't seem to be that level of solidarity and support for one another, especially when it comes to standing up for people's human and civil rights. So I kind of want to know, how do you feel seeing the transformation that has taken place in our community? Sometimes it almost seems like, because I don't believe this, but I'd say sometimes it almost seems as if people's labor may have been in vain. How does that, having seen the transition in the 60s and 70s and where we are today, how does that make you?
And I had that conversation with a friend of mine today, and I am prayerful. I don't know if we all embrace not just the sacrifices that people made in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, but we don't understand that desegregation does not mean that you are at a level playing field. And that's, we seem to be having more of a challenge where we feel that we're included because we get to live where they live, or we get to wear the same clothes that they wear, or we get to buy a car and be in debt, Because the one thing, and I think about the whole debt process, my grandmother reminded me that there was a time when people of color had to pay for things before they got.
Right.
Like if you were getting a washing machine or you were getting a refrigerator, everybody in the neighborhood cheered about it because you would have paid it off. You didn't put a down payment on it. When it was delivered to your house, it was paid for because people who look like us couldn't have stuff that wasn't paid for. Now we are buying stuff and we're in debt. So I'm real concerned about it. And maybe because of my age, people say, well, you know, she's old, she doesn't understand. But my daddy told us you are never to be on the mourner's bench at the bank. Never. And so, as you know, when we're talking about things that happen in town, the first 2 Black churches in South Carolina to get credit unions were Trinity and Cumberland.
Right.
Trinity and Cumberland. Now, Cumberland doesn't have a credit union right now, but Trinity Baptist Church has had a credit union since 1965. And it was about, so Reverend Frierson was the pastor at Cumberland, and he and Daddy said they did not want the people begging at the bank to be able to handle their business for their families. And they work with Reverend Burgess, and that's why you have Mount Zion Apartments. See, those 3 ministers worked together to write that plan for the Mount Zion Apartments. So Mount Zion got the public housing, and Trinity and Cumberland got the credit unions.
But they worked together to do.
Yes, they did.
Right, because I know some of us got together. It didn't work out, and it didn't because that level of support you talked about and working in solidarity and collaboration wasn't there. But just before we had the explosion of title loan places in South Carolina, some of us were trying to get a credit union together. And I often look at it and think back, especially a lot of folks don't know that Massachusetts and North Carolina have the 2 strongest anti-predatory lending laws in the country when it comes to title loan and check cashing places and those sort of things. And when North Carolina passed their law, all they did was cross the border and come to South Carolina. And I often think of how much debt people could have avoided. And Larry has heard me talk many times about this book, Holy Prophets, Prophets, Holy Prophets, Profits. And people have forgotten that so many businesses and institutions, schools, Spelman, Fisk, were formed with the support of churches, and sometimes literally within their walls.
And no doubt about it. Spelman was founded in the basement of a church in Atlanta.
Right.
And Morehouse moved from Augusta to Atlanta. And of course, Morris Brown is an AME school, and it's around the corner. And Clark is a United Methodist. So yes, they were founded. And you've heard me say my great-grandfather was the founding president of Friendship. And it was founded, a lot of people don't know, in York County, it was not until 1925 that Black students could go to public school in York County. So they had to go to the private school, just like it was with Laurinburg Institute in North Carolina. They were not allowed to go to public schools. So they went to what were junior colleges that had high school departments so they could graduate and be able to go to the next level. And so we're seeing it backwards. We're seeing others putting it together where their children will be able to go somewhere and not be in the classroom with our children.
Yeah, there seems to be some kind of line of demarcation today between churches feeling that spirituality and religion is one thing, but then the kind of things that your father, Benjamin Mays, John Lewis, and others, Fannie Lou Hamer, were involved in. These were these Christian folks,
Oh, yeah.
that they did not see a separation between what they should be doing in the community to help and benefit people and lift people up, and their songs and their praise and the preaching that went on in church. There was what was the thing that they have in a lot of AME churches, enter to worship, depart to and lead, and depart to serve.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so
So-
obviously that's how you were raised as well, right?
Yes, yes.
So how do we, I guess, get back to educating our young people on the kind of knowledge that they need to be able to make better decisions? Not just about credit, but about schools, about education, about careers, about a bunch of other things that for some reason we kind of have left a lost generation out there where they are not immediately responding to or relating to, I should say, the teachings of Dr. King or Reverend William D. Diggs or leaders in our community who sacrificed everything to get us here. Like Reverend Woodbury said earlier, we've come a long way. There is absolutely no doubt about it. We've come a long way. But at the same time, how are we doing with our children? How do we get our children into the conversation again?
Well, I think that for some reason we seem to be scared, like the the children get to run our lives. Now I don't, I've got like 9,000 kids, they're Head Start kids. I don't have any kids at my house. And I've got a nephew who teases me all the time, and he says, I'm like a third mother to him or something. But his grandmother and his mother. But I think that we need to be very upfront and very open. Our children need to know who we are and whose they are. And that families are very important. And that our family structures have helped them to be able to do all the little things they want to do. And sometimes we're almost too quiet about experiences. Sometimes there have been some experiences that we don't want to talk about because we think they are frightened children. If we find that they found out that somebody in their family was whipped in jail, or somebody went to jail, or someone, even if somebody did something wrong, the kids need to know and understand what family is all about. They need to know, and one thing that we will always encourage is that the altar at the altar is leveled. At the altar is leveled. The ground at the altar is leveled. It's not about what neighborhood you live in, what kind of car you drive, where you buy your clothes. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have the best of everything, but the altar is a level place for everybody.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, because when people don't know their history, then accomplishing some things seem impossible. But just, people just having the ability to know, hey, look at what we once had, look at what we once did, look what we once accomplished, and we had so fewer tools. We didn't have as many financial resources.
That's right.
We didn't have the training, the expertise, the knowledge, the education that we do now. But when people don't know their history, then things seem impossible, you know what I mean? Or hard.
I hope in Florence we will review, and Larry has begun to share information, but looking at our church history, E. Rainey Roberts is buried in the Baptist Cemetery, which is over, part of Northview. But E. Rainey Roberts was on the town council in Florence at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s. And between 1900 and 1905, he was pastor of Trinity. And then when he left, he went on to be president at Friendship Junior College after my great grandfather died. But he had a printing company in Florence, so he printed books about Black people in Florence, books that are all over the world. but our children need to know that. As we deal with the history of Florence, as we go around and we have little activities with people go on tours, we now know that there's the marker in front of what had been the Crest store, you know, the sit-ins there, because a lot of times, a long time people didn't know that, but we need to be upfront about it, because there are people making a sacrifice. Doesn't mean that you're always on the news and always in the paper, or somebody puts you in the history book. A lot of people made sacrifices. The one thing I remember about what was going on during the civil rights movement, and you probably saw in the paper a few years ago where they showed Lillian Grant, who was the secretary at Trinity for over 50 years. She was daddy's secretary, went to the March on Washington. When she went to the March on Washington, I was in the kitchen when the ladies were fixing her food and packing it in a train case for her to get on. And we all went to the train station. Children and families went to the train station, prayed with her, sang until she got on that train, because she was going for all of us. It's one person was going, but it was for all of us.
Yes, yeah.
And we need to look at that. It's a blessing that things are open more and you can do more, but we are still families. And we need
and we're not there yet. I mean, we may have a little more financially, we may have material goods, but as you said, the field outside away from the altar, you know, the ground is not level, the playing field is not level. You know, we still have African American families have a tenth in income and savings than their white counterparts do.
That's right.
Lots more for us to do.
That's right. That's right.
So how do we rectify this challenge? The challenge basically is that for some reason, our young people are not getting the message. Our young people, traditionally, we got it through the church, and as Reverend Woodbury said earlier, we did it with a lot less resources. We did it with a lot less money, like you talked about Perry Palmer's funeral home and going to Rock Hill and getting the students and bringing them back in a funeral car. You know, we did it with a lot less resources. Now that we have many more resources and much more access to revenue, we seem to be less effective in addressing and reaching our young people.
Well, I think that, but those of us who are not young have to have the same kind of conversations, even when you have your family reunions. I mean, what is the discussion about at the family reunion when you get together? And one thing that I think is interesting now, we kind of laugh about it. You know, growing up, when we had dinner, we sat at the table as a family. Even if Dad was going to the NAACP meeting, he ate dinner with us, then he left and went to the family. We sat there as a family. It wasn't that everything was on the stove and you went and got your little plate and, you know, sat in front of the TV. We sat there as a family. And we talked as a family. We watched the news as a family. And our parents gave us guidance, said, this is what you will and will not do as a family. And we have to, in our communities, whether you're young or old, we've got to look at what family is.
How do you teach young parents that, you know, fortunately for all of us in this discussion, and you saying, okay, I'm not a parent, but I have a nephew, and you're often, I'm sure, enlightening him on all of the things that needs to be enlightening. He needs to know whose grandson he is.
Yes.
Is it a point?
Yes.
And my son grew up here in Florence, and they knew from day one as young black males. And they knew what to do and how to do it. And they joined the NAACP Youth Council as young kids. And they were involved and his daughter, I just did an article on her. She's actually working on her PhD at home. So we're talking about there are those of us who are older who pay particular attention to that. But then there's those people who are between 30 and 50, I should say, who don't seem to think that those lessons are important to their children.
Right. And I said, Larry, and I said, we had less. Really, if we look at the history, there were times, I mean, when Africans were brought to this country off slave ships, we had nothing. when we were free from emancipated from slavery, people left plantations, they left slave quarters with what they had on their backs and what they could carry, with no roof over their head, no job, no business. And look at us now. And those are the kind of things, we have people thinking, if I don't have this, there's no need for me to try that. No, historically, you could look down through history, and we literally lifted ourselves up when we had nothing on at least two occasions. And so I think it's important that that somehow we get that message out. I'm not sure, Larry, we have Black History Month, we have
I
Juneteenth.
think it has to be a daily message, Reverend North.
That's what I say. It needs to be consistent,
Yeah,
right?
I think it needs to be consistent. And I think one of the challenges of it is we had the Kemet School here, remember?
Right.
And the Kemet School was that type of an academy. And for whatever reasons, some of us, including myself, unfortunately, didn't support it financially in the way that we should have, understanding the relevance and the importance of it to the foundation of teaching our kids from who they are and whose they were. And now we're at a situation where we don't have that rite of passage group, that group that's teaching our kids what to do. Bernie Goldman talks about that all the time in his articles in my newspaper, and to anybody who will listen. And the thing basically is, how do we get back to some type of an academy, some type of situation where those who want to, because you can't make everybody do, but those who want to can send their children to a Saturday morning class and be educated on the traditions and the culture that is so richly ours.
Right, and we talked about, we really need that here, and both of you use this term, and it's important because when we had nothing, right, we could remember who we were, and even when we were at a point where we couldn't remember what we were because for hundreds of years we had nothing, we knew whose we were. We knew that we belonged to God. We knew we belonged to the Creator. We knew that hope was, everything was not hopeless. And so I think it's that too. You have to have faith, and I'm not just saying it because I'm a pastor. You have to have something inside of you that no matter what happens, compels you to continue on, compels you to stay on the road, compels you to stay on the journey.
But I think it also requires an economic investment, and I think it requires an economic investment not from the federal government. Head Start is doing a great job of what they do for our kids at early learning stages. I mean, I've seen some of the kids that come out of Head Start who are now doctors and lawyers and who are outstanding professionals. So they're doing a great job. And a lot of those kids come from single parents. What I think is needed in our community is an institution just like what her grandfather started, which was Friendship College. And that is there to teach that missing link, there to teach those things that are not being taught, those things to those who want to learn, because we still unfortunately have people in our community who believe that they don't have a connection to the African continent, and they don't have a connection to to Black churches and even to Black organizations. Because they're accepted, like Mary Lynn said, they're accepted, and they drive the right car, and they live in a nice neighborhood. Malcolm said it a long time ago. You pay 3 times more to live in a neighborhood with other people than you would live in our neighborhood, and that's where we've come under sacrifice. Trinity has remained in the Black community. It hasn't moved to the other side of town. you know, at a time when there are a lot of Black churches that are large churches, that are mega churches, that are moved outside of the African American community and moved away from the training ground that they had to be able to access and to teach young people what needs to be done. So the challenge becomes how do we get some of our institutions, whether they're churches and other organizations, how do we get those back into our community? Even if they're coming there on a Saturday morning and spending a day there, or even if there's even if we're taking, you know, you talked about the church secretary going to the March on Washington. I ran across some kids recently that actually I took to the Minuteman March. We took myself and Elder Williams and some others took a busload of kids from Francis Marion to the Minuteman March. And I was in a store and I was having difficulty in that store. And the store manager said, "Mr. Smith, don't worry about it, I got it." And I said, and I was wondering how this guy know me. He said, "You took me to the Minuteman March." But he was the store manager. And so we are accomplishing smaller things. How can we broaden that scale? I understand that we're down to about the last minute.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
We told you that it would go fast.
Yeah.
And it did go fast. And I can tell you that it's been enjoyable, and you absolutely have to come back.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
There's so much more that you can share with us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
And Sister Diggs,
yes,
as you were talking, and we were discussing situations today. I thought of a name for you.
Oh.
You're a fire watcher.
Oh.
See, you know, they said that when fire was first discovered and people in tribes would have fire, someone had to stay awake throughout the night to make sure that the fire didn't die out. And then they had to carry the embers unto the next spot where the tribe would stay, and then be able to take those sparks and let them burst into flame, feed tinder and stuff to it. So thank you for having been and continue to be our fire watcher.
Well, thank you so much. Thank
you. You know, Leo, remember Woodbury is a world traveler. This year alone, I think he's been to Egypt and England and about 3 or 4 other countries. He's been all and he's got about 10 more on his next month. I just want to be like him when I grow up. Go ahead, Reverend Woodbury.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, why don't you tell people how they can contact you? Contact Head Start, and Larry and I will do the same.
Well, this is the South Carolina Head Start Collaboration Office. We're on the 3rd floor at the South Carolina Department of Social Services. And Wanda Davis, who is from Florence County, is the program assistant in the office with us. So we always talk about being PD pride. Our number here is area code 803-898-2550. But I'm in Florence every weekend. So if you see me, you can stop and talk to me in the grocery store. And I'm usually at the farmer's market buying vegetables because my mother only eats fresh vegetables. So you can just stop and talk to me. And Larry knows how to reach me on my cell phone, and he knows how to reach my brother.
All right. Now I'm Leo Woodbury, and you can reach me by going to New Alpha CDC.com, our website, or you can email us at info@newalphacdc.com, or call the church where I'm blessed to pastor, Kingdom Living Temple, 843-799-0740. And you, Larry?
I'm Larry Smith. I'm the publisher of the Community Times newspaper here in Florence and the Charleston Chronicles in Charleston. You can reach me at 843-667-1818. Online, you can reach us at communitytimessc.com, and we'll be able to answer any questions you might have about the show and about anything else going on in the community.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, my
Thank you.
friends, for joining us once again for the Leo and Larry show. Thank you so much, Sister Diggs. We
Thank
have to bring you back. And so until next week, this time, if you want to know where to go and you want to know what you should know, don't forget to tune in to the Leo and Larry show. God bless you.
Thank
It's
you.
about what you know. It's about where you go. If you really want to know, it's the Leo and Larry show. It's about what you know. It's about where you go. If you really want to know, it's the Leo and Larry show.